Good morning and good Friday. Mike Ongstad
Hey,
here with New America Movement. And of course, as always, joined by Joel Searby, our national political director and friend in Flannel. You might notice Joel sprucing it up a little bit today with the added vest and hat. So, always can accessorize with your Friday flannel.
that's right. That's right. Friday Flannel Panel is here, sporting the Vermont hat today, but coming to you from Florida. So, looking forward to this conversation, Mike.
Great. Well, thanks for joining me. And today we're going to be talking about the subject that seems to be on everyone's mind, and that is voting rights. As people probably have been following in the news, Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi have a package of voting rights bills that they want passed. Mitch McConnell, Kevin McCarthy doing their best to stop them. And we've been going through what procedural tricks can we use to try and get past the filibuster, get rid of the filibuster, keep the filibuster. What do we do? And Joe Biden, of course, taking this issue on as well, he gave a speech in Georgia in which he was accused of essentially calling Republicans modern day Bull Connors. And he then did a press conference a couple of days ago in which he is being accused to some extent of suggesting that the 2022 election will not be legitimate if these bills aren't passed. Now, we talk about this issue a lot, about protecting not only the legitimacy of our elections, but confidence in our elections being critical to protecting and preserving democracy. So it's tough when you see people on both sides coming up with different reasons for why they think elections may not be legitimate or were not legitimate, and undermining that confidence. I know you just spoke yesterday with Maricopa County Board of Supervisors Chairman Bill Gates, who's one of these kind of heroes of 2020 who stood up as a Republican involved and in charge of elections and said, hey, cut it out. This is real. Trump lost. So, what are your thoughts just first right away on the subject?
Yeah, I mean, talked to Bill Gates yesterday from Arizona. Have talked with Lieutenant Governor Duncan in Georgia, who had a similar story as a Republican, who basically stood up and said the elections were secure, they were legitimate. And first of all, I want to say I think we have to be careful not to let those who would undermine our democracy steal a phrase, and that is election integrity. I hate that they have taken that and made it their own little mantra. It's just two words that mean something important, and we shouldn't allow them to steal that. Election integrity is important, and it's a critical part of the foundations of our democracy. So I want to lay that marker down first. And my perspective is, and I should say, I'm much more on the political side than I am on the policy side. So others are way more versed in the actual ins and outs of the legislation. But I think it's important that we say our elections are secure. They are legitimate. They are highly secure and legitimate, not just kind of. They are highly secure and legitimate. And where I point to for that is 2020, when there was all kinds of shenanigans going on. I believe that what we found in the follow-up of all that and all the scrutiny that was given was that the elections were run in a very secure manner, whether it was vote by mail or otherwise. A great point to remember is places like Utah, heavily Republican state, has been running mail ballots for years. And so it's really kind of illogical to say, in my mind, that mail ballots are invalid, for example, or illegitimate or insecure. I worked in Florida politics for 15 years, and on the Republican side, and we relied heavily on the absentee and mail-in ballot process. That's how we won many elections, was working those ballots, and in a legitimate way. But it's a key part of voting in America. It always has been in the last quarter of a decade. So I think just overall message for me is our elections are secure. They are legitimate. Now, does that change that there are serious concerns? No, it doesn't. And I think that's maybe, Mike, where we should go with the conversation, is to more talk about the political threats to the legitimacy of our elections, because that's really where I think a lot of our viewers are interested. And that's certainly where we're focused as an organization right now, is in defending democracy against those who, as part of their political platform, would question the legitimacy of our elections, would perpetuate the big lie, and would even make a part of their campaign promises that they will essentially overturn any election that they don't like. And so that's the really dangerous stuff that I think we should focus on.
Yeah, absolutely. I just, real quickly, just want to read, Forbes had a good breakdown of kind of the back and forth that ended up with Biden when he was asked about whether or not the election was going to be legitimate in 2022. He said, and this is the quote everyone's been saying, "I'm not saying it's going to be legit. I do think I watched it live. I do think he misspoke and meant to say illegitimate, but that's taken the headlines. And his answer was not as strong as what you just gave, Joel. And that's I think my number one criticism would be I'd love the president of the United States, regardless of party, to stand up there and when asked if a previous election was legitimate or if the next election was going to be legitimate, to say yes. And there you might need, to your point, you might need some caveats. And Biden rightly pointed out that people just tried to overturn the 2020 election, and some of those people are still up to it, right? So I think you got to say 2022 is going to be legitimate, but that doesn't mean that we can just trust that nothing is going to happen,
right?
Because those threats are still lurking. And a lot of those people, like Bill Gates and like Jeff Duncan, are being challenged by their party to be replaced by people who specifically would overturn the election, or secretaries of state who specifically would overturn that election.
Yeah.
But real quickly, I just want to say, Donald Trump responded to Joe Biden's comments, and he said, President Biden admitted yesterday in his own very different way that the 2020 election may very well have been a fraud. This is the dynamic we're getting to. Anytime you start talking about how there could be fraud or how there could be a problem or there is a lurking danger, one that Trump cultivated, pushed for, and as you're seeing investigations in Georgia proceed, may have criminally tried to enact. Anytime you talk about that, then the other side just kind of blows up and goes, oh, well, I guess fraud is a real big problem, and so now we need all these new laws, and now we know that 2020 maybe was fraudulent. And it's just this false equivalence that tries to completely undermine confidence in the elections that just happened, and so it's just. We'll get to what you were saying, right? The threats are out there. We need to acknowledge them, but we also need to not give any oxygen to the people who want to take any threat that's out there and suggest, therefore, our elections are illegitimate.
Right. Well, and it becomes an easy boogeyman for people to scare other voters into supporting their preferred ideology, quite honestly. And I think both sides have been guilty of it. Now, I think I'm not giving saying the both sides argument that everybody likes to cancel people about on Twitter. What I'm saying is that it's an efficient political tool to motivate your political base by claiming that the other side is trying to take away your right to vote, the security of your elections, or really take anything away that feels like a threat. And so we're seeing that tool being employed. And let's not pretend that there aren't people in both the Republican and Democratic parties who know that and are using it to their political advantage. Now, where I think we fall at Renew America, and where it's really important that we continue to fight this fight, is that we get to do both, in the sense that when we take on a candidate who, for example, supports the big lie, we get to not only, unequivocally say that the 2020 election was secure and it was legitimate, while also saying, and we're about to see another one, but then we can use that as a clear differentiation between perhaps the candidate we might support, who is running against them, and a really important issue for voters to be aware of. So I don't like to use it as a scare tactic. What I like to do, when I think about our political strategy, is to use it as a very clear point of differentiation between one candidate and the other. And in some races, it could not be more stark. I mean, you have candidates running on the premise that the election was stolen in 2020, which is false. And then you have a candidate running against them, whom in many cases Renew America is supporting, who said, no, 2020 was a legitimate election, and here's why it's so important that we continue down that path. So I think it's an important political differentiation. Now, unfortunately, it is being used as a hammer and a wedge, and we have to continue to be really cautious about it. But we can't equivocate on the truth, which is that the election was legitimate. It was secure. It will continue to be so under the current approach. Now, some of the legislation that Republican legislators are passing at the state level around the country is dangerous, and it is undermining some very fundamental things. Now, there's room for discussion and disagreement, I think, on some of the things that people call restrictive. Certain things about, whether it's waiting times or certain ways of voting. I mean, those are certainly, pro-democracy advocates would say, let's make it as open and secure as possible. Others would say, we don't want to, we need to tighten it down a little bit. I think there's room for disagreement there. However, there are things that are being done that are much more procedural in nature that are dangerous, in the sense that you could have a situation where state legislators have way too much power, and the political process then kicks in instead of the voters getting to decide. Legislators can do a whole lot of funny business with what happens after the election, whether it be in the vote counting or in the way that disputes are resolved. So there's some dangerous stuff out there that I think we should be really aware of. That's important to the conversation.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think you've got the most clear and most obvious threats, right? And these are actually threats that will be pretty evident if they actually manifest, right? Like if Governor Kemp of Georgia had found 11,000 or however many more votes after the election, flags would have waved, right? Red flags would have waved. We would have known. And similar with some of these other strategies. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you can do anything about them, right? Like, that's the constitutional crisis, is like, what do you do if somebody like jumps off that cliff and goes full on in overturning an election? What are the actual constitutional legal remedies? If Mike Pence doesn't take the stance that he takes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So those are like the big things that are concerning. And then everything else we're talking about in these voting rights bills, I think they're critically important. But to your point, there is negotiation about how far do we need to go in one direction or the other. One thing I just love to get your take on, because as a longtime Republican operative and myself having worked in Republican politics for a long time as well, there's kind of something that my eyes have become opened to in the kind of last couple of years, and that is a mentality that I didn't even realize that I had, that I think is wrong and I think is prevalent in the Republican Party, and that is almost like voting should be somewhat of a burden. Right, like you should have to prove, in not in any real immense way, but you should have to prove that you want to vote to be a part of it. And so when you talk about so when you bring this up to Republicans, that there are hurdles like long wait times, for example, to voting, their response is like, well, I had to wait once to vote, and that's just what you have to do if you love your country. And I think I think that attitude is prevalent, and I think it's entirely wrong. I mean, one, look, you're never going to have a voting process without any type of waiting or any type of complication. Security is actually important, and there is just logistical problems, right? So we're not asking for some perfect solution, but the idea that you need to suffer somewhat for your vote is. One, it ignores the fact that people in some districts in Georgia waited 8 hours to vote, which is just an absolute absurdity and should never happen in a first world country running a democracy. But the other side of that is just the mentality, in my opinion, should be entirely different. And that is, it should be as easy to vote as possible. You should have no burdens other than the most basic ones necessary for the security and facilitation of the election. Do as little harm to the impulse or intent to vote as possible. And it strikes me that that's a fundamental divide between Republicans and Democrats right now.
Yeah, Mike, it's a tough topic, and I'm going to go there because I witnessed it firsthand for a decade. And let me just say, I believe this firmly because I know it to be true, and I can't speak for every state. But in Florida, Republican operatives rooted this idea in a primarily political place, not in a fundamentally principled place, which you would hope for, by saying, for example, well, it's a patriotic duty and it's a responsibility and it's an honor. That was the rhetoric they couched it in. But I was in dozens and dozens and dozens of rooms with political operatives on the Republican side who said some version of, if we make it easier to vote, then the Democrats will win more elections because lazy people vote for Democrats. And that is covered in all kinds of racial undertones and biases and things that are just, those were the kind of conversations that drove me out of the Republican Party. it had nothing to do with policy. I still remain a pretty conservative guy on most important policy issues, but I heard the kind of conversations that were just so crassly political. And those kinds of voting rights conversations were often rooted in that place. And I wasn't going to stand for it. And so as much as people might want to say that this is about those things like, the honor and the duty and the security to vote, et cetera, that is rhetoric that generally covers up for a fear, I believe, from Republicans that if more people can vote more easily, they will lose more elections. And that may actually be true in some sense, but my retort would be, then do a better job, then sell, be a better political party that people actually want to vote for instead of just trying to rig the game. Now, Democrats have been guilty of this in places where they have the stronghold, right?
Yeah.
And so they would say, for example, the same Democrats in Florida would fight tooth and nail. This is the real irony. We had some nasty fights with the Democrats over voting by mail because the Republican establishment, our operative core, was dominating the vote by mail process. We had better operatives doing better work. And so what did the Democrats do? They tried to restrict what we could do in communicating with absentee balloters. And so everybody was playing this game for different motivations, but we should not pretend that this was all some kind of a pure, high-minded, quest for the greatest democracy. This was about raw power, and I think it's important to remember that.
Absolutely. I think it's kind of one of the things I always think about politics, right? Is that you've got people who are in charge, or people who are the operatives who are doing the machinations behind the campaigns and the elections and whatnot, and they very, very clearly know what they're doing, right? But they can't do any of it without the support of the base of their party, right? And so I think one reason a lot of Republicans bristled at Joe Biden, and why a lot of Democrats, I think, recoiled at Joe Biden, kind of making a comparison to Bull Connor among the Republican Party, is that there's a whole bunch of people in that base. Now, there are out-and-out virulent racists and people who would nakedly grab power if they would in that base. Let's be very clear about that. But there are a lot of people who are not that way, but who are kind of sold this idea from that like upper tier of Republican operatives about elections. To your point, that's the rhetoric they use to justify the things that they're doing, to justify the gerrymandering, to justify the restrictions, the desire to, get rid of drop boxes entirely in the state of Wisconsin, for example. Right? That's their rhetoric. It's like, well, if you can't stand in line for, 1 hour, then do you really love this country? One, it might be more than 2 hours, and two, yes, you do still love this country.
Yeah.
But the other side of that is this notion that non-voters are Democrats, and it's absolutely baffling to me, because this is a tenet of faith among both parties. It's one of the only things they can agree on. Democrats absolutely think everyone who doesn't vote is a Democrat, and Republicans are terrified that everyone who doesn't vote is a Democrat. And what did we have in 2020? We had the highest electoral turnout in the history of our country. And yes, Donald Trump lost, but Republicans had a banner election. They won down ballot all over the place.
Yep.
So, and to your point about doing better, like, Republicans need to recognize, the strategists, they need to recognize there's an untapped market for what they're selling there. And I mean, that's a little bit terrifying to me, because what they're selling is actually kind of authoritarian and dystopian and terrifying. But there is an untapped market of republicanism, maybe in the traditional sense, I hope, among non-voters. But there's also a market for liberal Democrats, moderate Democrats, that can be reached. But you can't finely tune, nor should you finely tune elections to the point where you only reach one and not the other. Mm-hmm. And, so I am glad that Democrats didn't see the massive Republican electoral wave in 2020 and think, well, maybe we don't need to increase voting all that much. To their credit, they still are working and fighting to increase voter turnout. Republicans, bizarrely, because of how tied they are to the rise and fall of Donald Trump, are trying to take back all of those electoral changes that they think helped defeat Donald Trump, but that actually helped them, almost take the Senate and to win lots of House seats that they never expected, and that could be pretty critical in them taking back the Senate and the House in 2022.
Yeah, I think politically, Mike, you're seeing this now just beginning to trickle out among certain Republican leaders, because they're understanding that they might cut off their nose to spite their face if they're not careful. And what I mean by that is, they may so overreach that they will not realize the gains that many pundits are saying are going to come for Republicans. I'm not there yet. I think it's way too early, but people are already talking about a Republican wave, et cetera. To your point, they did pretty dang well around the country in 2020, and if they change things in such a way that they really mess with the system, they may see a backlash to that. And so I think you're starting to see people realize, as you see more and more people, for example, quietly taking on Trump, not so quietly for some. You see the discussion around, yeah, maybe he shouldn't be the nominee rising. You see DeSantis stepping in. I think those are recognitions that actually, Republicans didn't do so bad, and people will never say this publicly, but someone like DeSantis is realizing, yeah, actually Joe Biden beat Donald Trump because Donald Trump's a terrible human being and was not a good president, and then we won all these other races, Florida, for example, the Republicans continued to dominate. So maybe just maybe we actually have a system that works, and we should go out and compete in the marketplace of ideas. And that's where I'll turn it back is to say something that we talked about in the aftermath of the Virginia race. Give voters some credit. I mean, this is why one of the main reasons why our country is so amazing is because we have a secure democratic process, that gives us the option to go out and express our opinion and our desire about who we want to represent us in our various legislative bodies. And we actually do that. We make decisions. And I think 2020, if people could step back for 1 second from the crazy rhetoric, is actually a great example of that working out exactly how it's supposed to. Georgia, you talked to Lieutenant Governor Duncan, for example, in Georgia, and he makes this point in his book that he wrote recently that, hey, Republicans, wake up, guys. We won. We had massive gains in the state of Georgia. We did what we were supposed to do. Voters didn't want Donald Trump again. They rejected him. And so, that's what happened. And people want to obfuscate everything. What actually happened in 2020 is massive voter turnout. People said, we don't want Donald Trump. And enough of them said that they lost. And then many of them said, but I really like this guy over here in my district who's a Republican who, is a very reasonable guy. And he supports these principles that I care about. But man, that guy Trump, I can't take any more of that. So I'll reluctantly vote for Biden. That's how the system's supposed to work. People make decisions. And I think that's what happened in 2020. I wish that was the narrative. It's not, but that is the way I view it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I just think it highlights how much of like an absurd Greek tragedy the Republican Party is stuck in, because even if they recognize this truth, right, that increasing voter turnout could be beneficial to them to retake the House, retake the Senate, and even win a future presidential race with somebody who's not an authoritarian lunatic at the helm. They can recognize all of that, but they are so beholden to Trump. They are so afraid of I saw, Mo Brooks might get his Trump endorsement rescinded. Trump's trying to bring him in line. Mo Brooks is an out and out radical. And even he's kind of, going away from Trump, but they can recognize this, but they can't do anything about it because if they don't try and rein back in mail-in voting, if they don't try to eliminate drop boxes, if they don't spread the big lie that Trump won in 2020, then they're afraid they're going to get nuked from orbit by Donald Trump, and so. There's, I call it like an absurd Greek tragedy. They know, they can see the writing on the wall. They know it needs to be done, but they are just way too obsessed with Donald Trump to give up the big lie. And keeping the big lie means that you have to keep doing these things to try and restrict voting, reduce voting, and you have to claim that the elections are being inundated with bamboo ballots from China or whatever absurd conspiracies they raise.
China,
yeah. So we'll see what comes of this. I know, Joel, you've got a hard stop you've got to get to, but a great conversation. We'll see what comes. I for one would love to see Congress at least do like the Electoral Counting Reform Act as like a really low hanging fruit, something they could do and take a win there. But there are other, ending gerrymandering, kind of standardizing some of the requirements for voting across states so that people have kind of an equal opportunity to vote. I do think there's room, and I wish that Republicans would operate in good faith, try and negotiate with them for a bill. And on the counterpoint of this, I wish that Democrats would negotiate as well, because I think a lot of them think, we need every single thing in this basket or we won't move, and there's just no way that that's going to pass. So I do get the frustration that negotiating with Republicans right now is maybe not as fruitful as one would hope, but we'll see what happens, and hopefully something can happen on protecting our elections and increasing the vote rather than restricting it.
Yeah. Well, great conversation as always, Mike. And for those out there listening, keep up the good fight. Continue to tell the truth. Don't let the big lie perpetuate. Support candidates who stand up for our democracy, and we really appreciate you tuning in.
Yeah, thank you for tuning in. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. And hey, if you like this conversation, share it with your friends. There'll be plenty more Friday flannels, so make sure you stock up on some good prints and join us next Friday or when our next one is. Thank you all very much.